Thank you so much. And the remarks I prepared are more or less narrowly focused on the situation around the pandemic. Obviously, there's a lot to say about Russia's influence on traditional and social media in general through various disinformation tools. I would like to direct your attention and encourage you to read a very recent report released by the Global Engagement Center in the US on the pillars of Russian disinformation. I think it's fairly comprehensive. There's also a lot that has been written through by various think tanks and investigative reporting outlets, as well as government agencies in Europe and in the US. So, but in terms of how the Russian government has been using media and social media space to spread disinformation or alternative narratives or limit the objective narratives during the pandemic. Gulnoza already mentioned a number of things among the punitive measures. But I want to make a few general points and kind of go into three strategies that we're observing utilized by the Russian government to control the spread of the information about the pandemic, and then offer some of my thoughts on the effects of these tactics. In general, yes, the Russian government has not been interested in providing truthful information about both the coronavirus and the spread of the pandemic inside the country, as well as, and probably most importantly, institutional preparedness to handle such a giant public health crisis, because it was drastically unprepared. The general approach early on was either to ignore or downplay the severity of the pandemic. There were a number of narratives also on the etymology of the pandemic and the sources, and that it was imported, and lots of various conspiracy theories about how. But ultimately, what we saw early on in the late winter and early spring was kind of a complete dismissal of the problem, and even more so acknowledgement of the lack of resources and managerial preparedness to respond to a public health crisis. Although reports of unusual health issues and respiratory illnesses began surfacing in social media very early on, even in December, and Russia's proximity and also trade relations and travel to China are actually, very conducive to person-to-person contact. So once information started being reported worldwide and international media, especially about this unknown new virus and the effects it's having on public health, we saw that there was chatter coming up through social media, through WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, among just ordinary people saying, I had this very weird pneumonia or very severe respiratory illness with weird symptoms that I had never experienced before. And this was definitely very noticeable, but government did not acknowledge anything kind of at the central level. At the national level, Putin and the health ministry officials repeatedly brushed off the responsibility for managing the crisis and kind of delegated it to regional heads, and most likely it was done to diminish their own accountability in the eyes of the public, especially early on when so little was known about the nature of the virus. And this way, if anything went wrong, it could be local governors, regional governors who could be blamed for the mismanagement of the crisis, but not the national leadership. And ultimately, this strategy of denial comes with a very strong need to manage the flow of information in support of the official narrative. And here I group the strategy and the tactics and the strategy in kind of three broad categories. One is punitive measures. Second one is limiting public access to objective content. And third is forcing an alternative narrative that supports the government's point of view and version of the events. And so we talked a little bit about the punitive measures and obviously cracking down on journalists and using various administrative and criminal procedures to gag them and their ability to write, as well as limiting their access to data or access to buildings, whether it's hospitals or government offices, is one way. There was also a new law that had been passed very quickly at the onset of the pandemic, the so-called law on fake news, that targets individuals and outlets with a punishment of up to 5 years in prison and a very hefty fine, which I would say is around $25,000, $30,000. I guess that would be closer to what, 15,000, 20,000 pounds. And essentially it opens up a possibility of criminal persecution of individuals who share information that can be creating a threat that endangers people's lives or can be construed as a violation of public health order, or can be construed as a violation of public security, or can damage somebody's health. The interpretation can be very broad. And so under this law, the authorities fined a number of people, and there were at least 200 criminal cases that were started, according to the human rights group Agora. They were targeting very ordinary individuals who are using social networks to post about cases they knew. Especially early on, there were cases started targeting either medical professionals or individuals who were posting about friends or relatives who have access to data or work in medical institutions, and we're just saying how atrocious the situation was in the red zones of those hospitals. There was also, I believe James mentioned that, the restrictions on travel and just in general restrictions related to quarantine were one of those similar ways, a very kind of punitive way to limit the spread of information because of just how easily and eagerly the government was fining people for violation of the so-called quarantine regime. And there were at least 54,000 fines, and quite honestly, this whole quarantine business has turned out pretty profitable. So in April and June, there were close to $14 million in quarantine-related fines. And obviously the government doesn't want any transparency on this, but as we know, the Russian rent-seeking government structure is trying to use any opportunity at fining citizens to generate more revenue. The second category of measures is limiting foreign content, and therefore limiting the access of ordinary citizens to objective information. And here we saw, I mean, it's an ongoing battle. You probably know that there is an ongoing assault on certain foreign media by designating them as media foreign agents, which now forces these media to put a ginormous disclaimer on every single publication that this media outlet is a foreign agent, and ultimately is meant to discredit these outlets and humiliate them in the eyes of media consumers. this kind of comes in handy during this particular time because it's something that was already on the books. But we also saw a particular attempt by the Russian government to respond to foreign media publications about the state of Russian healthcare and the state of the pandemic inside the country. For example, Roskomnadzor demanded from Google that it block Financial Times articles on Russian websites, and that's one of the ways to do to limit foreign content. And I guess the third general category of responses was to push forward deliberately pro-government narratives. And here, again, this is very well documented as part of a much bigger problem that we observe with regards to Russia's government influence on information flow worldwide. And here, with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic, we have observed a few things. There is a mixture of narratives, and it depends on the target audience, whether it's domestic or external, European primarily. But inside the country, the main line is essentially asserting at this point, after weeks and months of denial, at this point, there's an assertion that Russian government is very deliberately and calmly succeeding in fighting the virus. There's well-documented, there's very well-documented suppression of official statistics and kind of the daily reported new cases or totals have plateaued at some point, and there's a number of investigative reporting that has been done to show that this is inconsistent with most trends and therefore suspicious. There is a narrative line that European and also US governments are lost, that they're creating mass hysteria, that they're making mistakes and losing the trust of their people. And therefore, Russian government essentially has an advantage because it's handling the situation so well in its own country, and it knows what it's doing. And now, as we know, there was this very broad announcement that a first vaccine was registered in Russia. And then we're also seeing narratives that the Russian government is kind of selectively or benevolently offering partnership in handling the crisis, and we saw it more in kind of not free environments rather than democracies by offering equipment. You remember probably there was a scandal about a shipment of ventilators to the United States, for example, that later turned out to be faulty, and there was very little, if any, coverage of that in Russian media, but it was covered pretty well in the US. And in general, Russian government peddles this narrative externally that if foreign nations are open to collaboration, it's very eager to provide assistance in fighting the coronavirus pandemic. And obviously there are more nuanced things, and there's always an anti-Ukrainian narrative present, and almost at any opportunity there is very drastic criticism of how, for example, Ukraine is handling the pandemic and things like that. But ultimately we can boil it down to this, the general line that Russia has its own way of fighting the pandemic, and it's the right way. And so I guess I'll conclude with a few notes on whether this has been effective at all or not, all these punitive measures and alternative narratives. And here we're seeing kind of a dual effect, I would say, and it depends on which part of society we're looking at, whether it's civil society and what we call the grass tops or the general public. Many ordinary citizens who continue to consume state-run TV channels and state-run media continue to be nonchalant about the pandemic and about the protective measures and don't necessarily believe in the pandemic or believe in kind of these conspiracy theories that are being pushed through various pro-government and alternative channels. However, at the civil society level and at the grass tops level, we're observing a very strong mobilization of resources despite all efforts of the Russian government. Medical professionals were the first ones to sound alarm about the critical situation in the hospitals while state media were silent. And the whole fake news law was likely in part a response to these reports bubbling up through social networks from the people who had firsthand knowledge of what's happening inside the hospitals. There are several independent outlets that ran extensive coverage of the pandemic inside Russia, reporting from the red zones and the hospitals, and it's Novaya Gazeta and Такие дела and a number of others. All efforts to suppress free media and suppress free speech, but that coverage was unprecedented, very robust, very daring, and certain medical officials and high-level officials, the hospitals that were designated to be treating COVID-19 patients were coming forward and speaking very openly about access to resources and availability of support from the state. Civil society and citizens organized to provide assistance to hospitals, to bring food, to bring protective gear, while nothing was coming from the health ministry or other official sources. And there were also efforts to pull together information on the medical professionals who have died as a result of exposure to COVID-19. And it actually amassed, the last I saw, it was close to 500 names across Russia that was being continuously verified. And the Russian officials denounced it and, of course, proclaimed it was all disinformation and untrue. And in general, I guess there was also a very interesting movement on behalf of lawyers who from the very beginning, from mid-March, started noticing the effects of the government's reaction to the spread of the virus and its effect on workers, on their labor rights, the effect on medical professionals and the various gag rules and whatnot. And lawyers organized the support and intake of complaints and provision of this legal assistance fairly quickly and have reported on it very openly. And so, in a sense, what we see is that despite all these punitive measures, despite all the denial or the pushing of alternative narratives, the society in Russia is very resilient, and people understand that it's important to provide truthful information at a time of crisis and ensure that this information gets to as many people as possible. So overall, we would say that society prevails over all possible restrictions. Yes, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes endurance, but it's definitely possible. And I'll stop here.